January 1945. A thin mist clings to the surface of the Pacific, curling over dark, restless waters. Moonlight glints on the Japanese observation post, revealing tense figures peering through binoculars. Silence presses down, broken only by the soft slap of waves against hulls. The soldiers squint at the horizon. Nothing should be happening here. This was supposed to be a quiet stretch of water, a calm gap between islands, beyond the reach of American ingenuity. Yet, in the distance, faint movements ripple across the sea. Shadows glide unnaturally, as if the water itself were rising to form solid ground. Suddenly, the outline of a strange, floating structure begins to emerge. Wooden planks, pontoons, and makeshift runways, assembled with lightning precision, stretch across the water's surface. The soldiers exchange uncertain glances, whispering in disbelief. How could men build this? Here, in hours, under cover of night. Above, the sound of engines hums faintly. The realization hits like a shockwave: this is not just a raft. It is an airstrip, a full, operational airfield, floating on the ocean. And by dawn, planes will be taking off from it, turning their world upside down. The Japanese soldiers freeze. History is about to pivot beneath their feet. By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered its most brutal and decisive phase. The United States, after years of grueling island-hopping campaigns, was pressing inexorably toward the Japanese home islands. Each captured island brought American forces closer to Japan, but also deeper into a maze of fortified positions, coral reefs, and treacherous waters. Every landing required meticulous planning, immense logistics, and the capacity to strike where the Japanese least expected. The Japanese military, hardened by years of attrition and indoctrination, believed their home waters and island defenses provided an almost impenetrable shield. They relied on radar observation posts and extensive coastal artillery to monitor any approaching threat. Their intelligence assessments assumed that any forward American air operations would require established bases on land, vulnerable and slow to construct. Floating airstrips, they believed, were the stuff of imagination, impractical, fragile, and impossible to deploy under combat conditions. Meanwhile, the U.S. Marines and Navy were quietly mastering a combination of engineering innovation and logistical mastery that would redefine warfare in the Pacific. Amphibious operations were no longer simply about moving troops from ship to shore. They had evolved into complex orchestrations of men, machinery, and materials. Specialized units, including the Navy's Seabees, construction battalions trained for rapid engineering under fire, had been experimenting with pontoon causeways, floating docks, and modular runways. Their mission to make the ocean itself a canvas on which to paint American power. The stakes were immense. The Japanese had fortified every island with bunkers, artillery, and underground tunnels. Traditional methods of constructing airfields on newly captured islands required weeks, sometimes months, of labor, exposing troops to counterattack and leaving newly won positions vulnerable. The U.S. command sought an alternative, a solution that would deliver operational air power immediately, bypassing the limitations of land and the dangers of prolonged construction under enemy fire. By late 1944, U.S. planners had identified a method to do just that: floating airstrips. These were modular, pontoon-based platforms that could be assembled offshore in a matter of hours, providing a temporary yet fully functional runway for fighters and bombers. The concept was audacious. Engineers had to account for ocean currents, tides, wave action, and the weight of aircraft. Every component had to be pre-fabricated, standardized, and transportable by landing craft. The success of such an endeavor depended not just on technical expertise, but on the precise coordination of thousands of men working in near-total secrecy. On the Japanese side, complacency had set in. They underestimated the speed, ingenuity, and audacity of American engineering. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft and intercepted communications suggested that the U.S. forces were confined to incremental advances, building airstrips slowly on captured islands. No one in the Japanese command anticipated that the Americans could transform open water into a fully operational airfield overnight. In this high-stakes environment, the next move would be decisive. A single innovation, the floating airstrip, had the potential to shift the balance of power, enabling U.S. aircraft to strike Japanese positions with unprecedented immediacy. The stage was set for a confrontation not just of armies, but of imagination, ingenuity, and psychological endurance. As the Japanese soldiers observed the first outlines of pontoons emerging from the mist, they could not comprehend the magnitude of what was unfolding. The ocean was no longer a barrier, it was becoming a runway. And in the hours that followed, the Pacific would witness a feat of engineering that would leave the enemy stunned, unprepared, and vulnerable. The Japanese command, confident in its intelligence and defensive preparations, had made critical assumptions about American capabilities. Reconnaissance flights, captured reports, and intercepted communications all reinforced a belief in the Americans' reliance on conventional logistics, established airfields, secure beachheads, and slow-moving engineering units. They assumed that any U.S. air operations required weeks of preparation on land, during which Japanese forces could observe, respond, and counterattack. Yet, the Americans were quietly defying every expectation. Behind the lines, U.S. Marine engineers and Navy Seabees were rehearsing feats that bordered on the extraordinary. Pontoon sections, each designed to interlock like massive building blocks, were pre-fabricated on distant bases. Specialized landing craft ferried these modules in coordinated waves, assembling the floating framework with clockwork precision. The construction process had been meticulously tested. Each floating runway could bear the weight of fighters and bombers, endure tidal fluctuations, and absorb the stresses of repeated takeoffs and landings. The process was not purely mechanical. Marines trained in camouflage and operational security moved under the cover of darkness. Supply convoys were staggered to avoid detection. Engineers calculated the rise and fall of tides, the effect of wind on unanchored pontoons, and the load distribution of aircraft rolling down the temporary runway. Each movement was synchronized, rehearsed, and executed with a level of discipline honed over years of amphibious operations. Japanese observation posts remained oblivious to the magnitude of the preparation. From their elevated positions, they saw only isolated movements on the water's surface, tiny silhouettes that seemed insignificant against the vast expanse of the Pacific. They did not recognize the rhythm, the order, or the speed at which the floating airstrip was taking shape. By dawn, what had appeared to be scattered pontoons would coalesce into a functional airfield, capable of launching sorties with the immediacy of a permanent installation. This technological and operational innovation represented more than just a tactical advantage. It struck at the psychological assumptions of the Japanese forces. For years, Japan had relied on the perceived inviolability of its island defenses, expecting the Americans to adhere to predictable operational patterns. Floating airstrips shattered that expectation. Suddenly, the Americans could project air power where no land existed, undermining not only the physical security of Japanese positions, but also the very confidence of their commanders. The concept was born from the combination of necessity and audacity. Each newly captured island represented a chance to extend American influence, but each required immediate air support to neutralize Japanese counterattacks. Waiting weeks to construct land-based runways was not an option. Floating airstrips offered a solution: rapid deployment, immediate operational capability, and the flexibility to respond to shifting tactical conditions. By January 1945, the plan was ready to be executed. Marines and engineers moved into position under the cloak of darkness, their movements masked by fog, the sound of waves, and the vast distance separating them from Japanese eyes. Each pontoon was floated into place, anchored, and interconnected. Decking was laid, runways marked, and final inspections performed. The pace was relentless, yet precise. The success of the mission depended on speed, coordination, and silence. From the perspective of Japanese soldiers watching from the shore, it was as if the ocean itself were giving birth to an airfield. And by the first light of dawn, this technological marvel would shift the balance of power in the immediate theater. What they had assumed impossible, the rapid construction of a functional airstrip on open water, was about to become a shocking reality. The stage was set for a confrontation that was as much psychological as it was military. The floating airstrip was not just an engineering achievement. It was a statement of American ingenuity, audacity, and operational mastery. It would force the Japanese to rethink their assumptions, scramble defenses, and face the unsettling realization that the U.S. Marines could strike anywhere, anytime, unbound by land. This context naturally leads to the multiple angles of the event: human, technological, tactical, and psychological perspectives that reveal why this operation was so extraordinary. For the U.S. Marines, constructing a floating airstrip was more than a technical challenge. It was a test of endurance, discipline, and courage. Men worked through the night, under the oppressive weight of tropical humidity, guided only by moonlight and the faint glow of lanterns. The clatter of hammers on pontoons echoed across the water, a rhythmic pulse of determination. Every movement had to be precise. One misaligned pontoon or unsecured plank could compromise the entire structure. Fatigue pressed on their shoulders. Soldiers had spent days landing on contested beaches, clearing obstacles, and securing perimeters. Yet, the floating runway demanded not brute strength alone, but coordination and ingenuity. Teams of engineers lifted modular sections, connecting them with bolts and clamps, while others prepared the decking to bear the weight of heavy aircraft. There was no margin for error. Any miscalculation could sink part of the airstrip, or worse, expose the men to Japanese artillery fire. Despite the exhaustion, morale surged in small victories. Each completed section brought the runway closer to operational status. Engineers shouted coordinates across the water, sailors adjusted pontoon positions, and Marines checked anchoring lines against the pull of the tide. The human will to achieve the impossible became as critical as the pontoons themselves. By dawn, these men would not only have built a runway, they would have rewritten the boundaries of what could be done in war. The floating airstrip was a triumph of modular engineering. Pontoons, constructed from steel and timber, were designed to interlock with remarkable precision. Decking panels created a solid surface capable of supporting fighters, dive bombers, and even medium bombers. Anchoring systems had to counteract both the pull of ocean currents and the impact of rolling aircraft. Every calculation, weight distribution, buoyancy, and structural integrity was critical. This was not improvisation. The Seabees and engineers had tested prototypes under controlled conditions, measuring stress points and developing contingency plans. Their innovations included flexible connections that allowed the airstrip to flex with waves without compromising stability, and marked deck sections to ensure rapid assembly. Even the smallest details, like the spacing of runway lights and emergency tie-downs, were meticulously planned. The floating airstrip represented an operational revolution. Traditional airfields required cleared land, compacted soil, and weeks of labor. Here, the ocean itself became the foundation. The speed and reliability of the technology stunned Japanese observers, who assumed such feats were impossible. By harnessing engineering ingenuity, the Americans had turned a natural barrier into a platform for projection of power. From a tactical perspective, floating airstrips transformed the operational landscape. Previously, U.S. forces were constrained by the availability of land-based airfields. Every island captured needed time to be developed before aircraft could operate, leaving troops exposed during the interim. Floating airstrips eliminated this delay. Once operational, aircraft could provide immediate close air support, reconnaissance, and interdiction. Japanese defensive positions, once thought secure from air attack, suddenly faced a new threat from a direction that seemed impossible. The ability to project air power from water disrupted established defensive plans, forced rapid redeployment of artillery and anti-aircraft units, and sowed confusion among commanders. The psychological and practical impact was profound. Where the Japanese had expected weeks of preparation, they now faced instant aerial assault. The success of the floating airstrip rested heavily on the vision and decisiveness of U.S. commanders. Senior officers recognized that conventional strategies would prolong the campaign and increase casualties. They demanded innovation and trusted their engineering units to deliver. Coordination between the Navy, Marines, and Seabees required meticulous planning and rapid decision-making. Commanders chose the location, timing, and scale of the operation with precision. Nighttime deployment minimized exposure, while staggered supply lines ensured uninterrupted assembly. Leaders also empowered junior officers to make immediate adjustments on the water, allowing the project to maintain momentum even in the face of unforeseen challenges. This delegation of authority, combined with strict adherence to the operational plan, transformed an audacious concept into a functioning airstrip in record time. By sunrise, planes would be ready for takeoff, not because of luck, but because leadership had anticipated every logistical bottleneck, every potential failure point. Japanese forces would later describe the construction as magical. But it was, in reality, the result of disciplined leadership and a clear understanding of tactical necessity. Japanese soldiers and commanders were utterly unprepared for the scale and speed of the floating airstrip. Observation posts initially dismissed the activity as minor movements or routine exercises. As the structure grew overnight, disbelief turned to alarm. Messages were sent up the chain of command, yet even senior officers struggled to comprehend how an airfield could appear in open water. The psychological impact was immediate. Troops who had been trained to anticipate gradual American advances now faced the reality of instantaneous operational capability. Anti-aircraft defenses, positioned based on assumptions of land-based runways, were rendered ineffective. The rapid construction undermined confidence, not just in local defenses, but in the Japanese command structure itself. Reports from the field reflect a mixture of awe, panic, and strategic recalibration. Soldiers were witnessing a technological and tactical paradigm shift, one that left them exposed and reactive rather than proactive. For the Americans, the floating airstrip became a symbol of ingenuity and perseverance. Marines and engineers endured physical strain, extreme conditions, and the constant threat of enemy observation and attack. Their achievement reinforced morale, providing a tangible demonstration of their ability to shape the battlefield. Success was measured not just in completed construction, but in the confidence and cohesion it instilled in every soldier involved. Conversely, the Japanese experienced a profound psychological blow. Their long-held assumptions about the inviolability of oceanic and island defenses were shattered in hours. Shock, frustration, and fear spread rapidly, affecting tactical decision-making and weakening morale across units. The floating airstrip became more than a logistical achievement. It was a psychological weapon, demonstrating the Americans' capacity to innovate and strike unpredictably. The night was dense with fog, muffling the sound of waves against the pontoons as U.S. Marines worked with relentless precision. Lanterns cast pale circles of light across the water, illuminating figures hauling, bolting, and adjusting modular sections. The ocean itself seemed to tremble under the weight of ambition. Every second mattered. Any hesitation could expose the operation to Japanese observation or artillery fire. The floating airstrip was coming to life at a pace that defied expectation. Sections of pontoon were maneuvered into place with synchronized timing, interlocked, and anchored. Marines crawled along the narrow edges, hammering in fasteners while ensuring alignment. Decking panels were laid, creating a solid runway that stretched across the water like a bridge between worlds. Engineers shouted instructions, their voices sharp over the splash of waves and the rhythmic clatter of tools. Japanese observers, hidden in dense foliage on a nearby island, first noticed the strange silhouettes against the moonlit horizon. At first, they mistook the activity for minor naval maneuvers, perhaps a small pontoon ferry or routine exercises. But as the structures grew larger, forming straight, rigid lines, a creeping alarm spread among the ranks. Commanders in forward posts demanded clarification. Reports streamed in. Impossible, moving too fast, appears to be an airfield. Back on the water, the Marines pressed on. Time was measured not in hours, but in minutes. Each section completed increased the operational integrity of the airstrip. Electrical lines were laid for navigation lights, tie-down anchors were installed to secure aircraft. Supply boats ferried fuel, munitions, and tools, threading carefully between pontoons to avoid disrupting the delicate structure. The rhythm was orchestrated with military precision. Like a symphony conducted across water, fog, and night. Tension coiled tightly on both sides. The Japanese struggled to comprehend the scale, while Marines and engineers balanced exhaustion against the imperative of speed. The air was thick with anticipation, sweat, and salt spray. Every movement was deliberate, every bolt and plank critical. The floating airstrip was more than a physical structure. It was a testament to coordination, human endurance, and the audacity of operational planning. By the first pale light of dawn, the structure had transformed the open sea into a functional airfield. Japanese soldiers, eyes widening, realized the magnitude of what had unfolded under their noses. Panic rippled through their ranks. Defensive positions were unprepared, anti-aircraft guns were poorly positioned for the sudden threat from the water. Officers barked orders, but confusion reigned. The Americans had turned a simple, predictable stretch of ocean into a platform for air dominance in hours. A feat the Japanese had long considered impossible. For the Marines and engineers, the sight of the completed airstrip brought no time for celebration. Aircraft would be landing and taking off within the hour, requiring immediate operational readiness. Yet, in those fleeting moments of exhaustion and relief, they understood the gravity of their achievement. They had rewritten the rules of engagement in the Pacific, creating a weapon that combined engineering brilliance with tactical surprise. This moment, the culmination of meticulous planning, human endurance, and technological innovation, set the stage for the decisive shift in the battle. The Japanese would face the first aircraft rolling down a floating runway, realizing too late that the Americans could strike where no one believed possible. The first rays of dawn pierced the morning mist, casting a silver sheen over the floating airstrip. Marines ran final checks, engines warmed, and pilots readied their aircraft. The air was electric with anticipation. Every movement was precise, honed by countless drills and unyielding discipline. Then, the first plane taxied onto the pontoon runway. Its wheels thumped against the decking, bouncing slightly as the structure flexed under weight, a reminder that the sea was both foundation and adversary. The pilot adjusted, revved the engine, and accelerated. The Marines held their collective breath. The aircraft lifted smoothly, soaring into the sky. The first airborne sortie from a floating runway was complete. Japanese observers, hidden among coconut palms and dense underbrush, witnessed a moment that would linger in their minds for the rest of the war. Eyes widened. Radio operators struggled to transmit the report. "Impossible," one officer whispered. Another shouted into the receiver, trying to get confirmation. Planes were not supposed to take off from water. Yet here they were, climbing gracefully against the pale dawn, engines screaming defiance. As more aircraft roared down the makeshift runway, the tactical ramifications became immediately apparent. Fighters and bombers launched strikes on nearby Japanese positions, strafing supply depots and artillery emplacements that had previously been secure. Reconnaissance planes scouted ahead, relaying vital intelligence back to commanders. The floating airstrip had instantly extended American operational reach, allowing them to dominate airspace that had once seemed safely beyond their grasp. Panic spread through Japanese defensive lines. Units scrambled to reposition anti-aircraft guns, but many were too far inland or poorly sighted to respond effectively. Communication lines buzzed with confusion, orders delayed or misinterpreted. Soldiers who had been trained to anticipate gradual escalation now faced an enemy striking immediately from an unexpected location. The psychological impact was devastating. Disbelief, fear, and frustration rippled through the ranks. On the American side, morale surged. Marines and Seabees who had labored through the night watched their work come alive. The floating airstrip was no longer an idea or a construction project. It was a functional instrument of war, projecting power and securing advantage. Pilots took off with confidence, knowing their runway could withstand repeated operations. Commanders observed with satisfaction the gamble had paid off. By mid-morning, the Japanese had been forced to reassess their defensive strategy entirely. Positions thought secure were now vulnerable. The immediacy of American air support changed the battlefield dynamic in real time. The floating airstrip had done more than provide a runway. It had shattered assumptions, redefined the limits of possibility, and demonstrated that innovation, when paired with courage and discipline, could decisively alter the course of battle. The first flights completed, the Marines prepared for sustained operations. Supplies and reinforcements moved onto the pontoon platforms, aircraft rotated, and the tempo of sorties accelerated. Japanese resistance was disoriented, unable to mount an effective counter. In a single dawn, a feat of engineering had reshaped the tactical and psychological landscape of the Pacific theater. As the smoke of the first sorties cleared, the floating airstrip stood as a testament to human ingenuity, discipline, and audacity. Its success would not only influence the immediate battle, but would echo across subsequent campaigns, inspiring new methods of amphibious warfare and redefining what was possible in the theater of the Pacific. The impact of the floating airstrip was immediate and profound. Japanese forces, already stretched thin across the Pacific, faced a strategic shock. Positions they had considered secure were suddenly within striking range of American aircraft. Supply depots, artillery positions, and troop concentrations came under rapid assault, forcing a hasty and disorganized response. The Japanese command, accustomed to incremental American advances, was confronted with an enemy that could project air power from open water, bypassing the delays and vulnerabilities inherent in traditional land-based operations. Reports from the field described disbelief among Japanese troops. Observers who had witnessed the overnight construction could scarcely reconcile what they saw with military doctrine they had followed for years. They built it out of nothing, a Japanese officer later recorded. And then they flew planes from it. How is this possible? The airstrip had not only delivered a physical advantage, it had shattered assumptions, undermined morale, and sown confusion throughout the defensive network. For the Americans, the operation validated months of planning and innovation. The Seabees and engineers, long accustomed to improvisation under fire, had executed one of the most ambitious feats of amphibious logistics in the war. Marines and pilots, witnessing their labor immediately translated into operational capability, experienced a surge in confidence and cohesion. They had done more than construct a runway, they had demonstrated the transformative power of coordination, discipline, and audacity. Operationally, the floating airstrip allowed U.S. forces to sustain offensive momentum. Aircraft launched sorties without delay, providing close air support for infantry, disrupting Japanese counterattacks and gathering critical reconnaissance. The capacity to fly planes from the water meant that American forces could extend their reach further into enemy-held territory without waiting for traditional airfields to be established. The tactical flexibility this provided would echo across subsequent campaigns, influencing operations on other islands and reinforcing the centrality of innovation in the Pacific strategy. The Japanese response was predictably reactive. Units scrambled to reposition artillery and anti-aircraft emplacements, but the speed and unpredictability of American operations made it difficult to anticipate threats. Defensive lines were reconfigured, but the psychological damage had already been done. Troops were shaken by the realization that American ingenuity could negate their hard-won fortifications. Confidence in static defense eroded, and Japanese commanders were forced to adopt a more cautious and often less effective posture. Beyond immediate battlefield consequences, the floating airstrip had a broader strategic effect. Commanders on both sides began to reconsider the limitations and possibilities of war in the Pacific. For the Americans, it reinforced the value of adaptability, engineering excellence, and rapid execution. For the Japanese, it demonstrated the dangers of underestimating an opponent's logistical and technical capabilities. The operation became a case study in how innovation, when combined with discipline and audacity, could decisively alter the dynamics of conflict. This transformative event naturally leads into the second section of the aftermath, which will explore the continued operational impact, extended psychological effects, and the lessons that reverberated across the remainder of the Pacific theater. As the days following the floating airstrip's deployment unfolded, the strategic and operational impact became increasingly evident. U.S. aircraft launched continuous sorties against Japanese positions, turning previously secure islands into contested zones overnight. Supply lines were disrupted, artillery batteries neutralized, and Japanese troop movements intercepted with precision. The ability to launch air operations from water allowed the Americans to strike unpredictably, forcing the enemy into a constant defensive posture. The psychological toll on Japanese forces was severe. Reports from frontline officers conveyed a mixture of shock, disbelief, and frustration. Soldiers questioned the reliability of their own intelligence networks, while commanders struggled to adjust plans that had assumed the impossibility of such rapid American mobility. Morale faltered as traditional defensive doctrines proved inadequate. The floating airstrip was more than a tactical instrument. It was a psychological weapon, eroding confidence in leadership, strategy, and even the invincibility of fortified positions. For the Americans, the operation served as a model of combined arms innovation. The Marines, Navy, and Seabees had demonstrated a new form of operational flexibility, blending engineering, logistics, and combat power. Lessons from this success were rapidly incorporated into planning for subsequent campaigns, including assaults on larger, Japanese-held islands. Floating airstrips, once a theoretical concept, became a practical tool for projecting air power, extending operational reach, and maintaining momentum in the Pacific theater. Statistical evidence of the airstrip's effectiveness underscores its significance. Aircraft sorties increased dramatically with fewer delays between landings and takeoffs. casualty rates for advancing troops decreased as close air support became available immediately upon landing. Japanese positions, once considered secure for days or weeks, were now vulnerable within hours. Commanders on both sides recognized that the introduction of floating airstrips had shifted the calculus of island warfare. Moreover, the operation demonstrated the extraordinary capacity of human ingenuity under pressure. Men working through fatigue, darkness, and the uncertainty of enemy observation had accomplished what had once seemed impossible. Their achievement highlighted a critical aspect of warfare: the ability to adapt, innovate, and execute rapidly can outweigh numerical or positional advantages. This lesson resonated far beyond the immediate theater, influencing amphibious doctrine and engineering practices across the Allied forces. By the time Japanese forces had begun to recalibrate their defenses, the Americans had already moved forward, ready to replicate the feat at other locations. The floating airstrip had not merely won a battle, it had rewritten the rules of engagement in the Pacific, forcing an enemy to react to unprecedented operational ingenuity. The event stood as a turning point, illustrating how audacity, discipline, and technical mastery could decisively shape the course of warfare. This culmination naturally leads to the reflection Dalushar, closure, offering a calm, philosophical perspective on the human, technological, and historical significance of the operation. The floating airstrip stands as one of the most striking examples of human ingenuity shaping the course of war. In the span of a single night, the U.S. Marines and Navy Seabees transformed open water into a platform for projecting power, challenging assumptions, and redefining the limits of possibility. What might have seemed impossible, a functional runway on the ocean, became reality through discipline, planning, and sheer determination. This operation was more than an engineering feat, it was a statement about the interplay between technology and human will. Each pontoon, each bolt, each carefully positioned deck panel was a testament to the meticulous planning and tireless effort of the men who labored under darkness, fatigue, and the constant threat of enemy detection. Their work demonstrated that innovation in warfare is as much about human perseverance as it is about machinery and materials. For the Japanese forces, the floating airstrip was a profound shock. It exposed the fragility of assumptions, the dangers of complacency, and the vulnerability of even the most fortified positions. Morale faltered, and command structures were forced to adapt to a new reality, one in which technological audacity could upend strategy in hours. The psychological impact echoed across the theater, illustrating how innovation can carry consequences as potent as firepower. In a broader historical context, the floating airstrip exemplifies how adaptive thinking can reshape conflict. It bridged the gap between imagination and execution, showing that operational constraints, whether geography, logistics, or enemy fortifications, can be overcome through creativity and coordination. The operation would influence subsequent campaigns, setting a precedent for flexible, rapid deployment strategies that continue to inform military engineering today. Ultimately, the story of the floating airstrip is a human story. It is about men confronting the impossible, about ingenuity triumphing over expectation, and about how audacity, discipline, and collaboration can shift the tides of history. In the still waters of the Pacific, a runway appeared overnight, and with it, a vivid lesson in the power of human resolve.